was born in England. In theory, I could have chosen to move away. In practice, I have not done so. But, even if I had no choice in the matter, by living in a particular country, I am making a commitment to abide by the laws of that country. This commitment may be implicit, rather than a promise I have ever made explicitly, but it is nonetheless binding on me. Other people will certainly regard me as breaking a commitment, if I break the law. Now, laws constrain the options available to me. If I break the law, I have not only broken a commitment, but I will also be punished. And, whether or not I break the law, I will have to pay taxes to meet the cost of law enforcement. All in all, the law looks to be an onerous and costly burden on me. So, why do we have laws? One reason that we have laws is that they arise quite naturally over time. To see this, consider a hypothetical scenario where law and order has broken down in a particular area. It is likely that area will be carved up between various gangsters or warlords. There are many historical examples of this, ranging from gangsters in 1920s Chicago to the seizing of land by barbarian war bands during the breakup of the Western Roman Empire. Typically, this results in a structure with a leader, let's call him the warlord, at the top, supported by a gang of henchmen who enforce his will. The warlord may well win that position by being physically stronger and more violent than those around him. Initially, the warlord and his gang may simply support themselves by looting from the local population. But, this is not a sensible long-term strategy. If the population know that anything they produce is likely to be stolen from them, then they are not going to be motivated to stick around and produce things. So, the warlord will end up as master of an uninhabited wasteland. To prevent this, the warlord might seek to enslave the local population, but that requires an increased number of henchmen, who will be needed to force the slaves to work, and prevent them from revolting or running away. Now, henchmen need to be well rewarded, or they will either go and work for another warlord, or seek to overthrow the warlord, and reward themselves with his assets. Rewarding these extra henchmen is an expensive business, and the warlord may well wish to save that expense for his own benefit. Furthermore, if a neighboring warlord attacks, which, in the circumstances I am hypothesizing, is likely to be a fairly common occurrence, the slaves may see this as an opportunity to revolt. Keeping a guard over the slaves means the warlord will be less able to defend against the attack. Similarly, if the warlord wants to attack a neighbor, he will not be able to use the full strength available to him, as it will be necessary to leave some of his force behind, to keep the slaves subdued. So, rather than enslaving the population, and forcing them to work, the warlord may design a system where the population are motivated to work for themselves. This requires people to have confidence that they will benefit from that work. This doesn't necessarily mean that the population are free. The key point is that if people benefit from their own work, there is no need to put them in chains and stand over them with a whip to ensure that they do that work. Consider, for example, the position of a medieval serf. One way to so motivate people is to have a system where the population make defined payments to the warlord. This might be an annual per head payment, a payment of a proportion of what is produced, payments for using infrastructure such as bridges, payments to use a market, or provision of specified services in kind. This means the warlord has a predictable income, and the population can be relatively confident that, once they have made their payments, they will get to keep what they have left. Note that these payments are not voluntary. If you don't pay, the warlord and his gang will knock you about, destroy your property, and take all your stuff, rather than just the payment that was originally stipulated. The situation is essentially one of gangsters running a protection racket. However, even under such a system, if they think that after they have paid their protection money to the warlord, other people or neighboring warlords might come and steal what remains to them, the population may still be unwilling to take the time and effort to produce things. So, it is in the warlord's interest to impose at least rudimentary law and order, and to protect the territory from raiders and invaders. If the warlord is successful in imposing law and order, provides effective protection against the depredations of neighboring warlords, and the level of protection money demanded is not too high, then the population are likely to come to consider that the protection money is a price worth paying, so that they can get on with their lives in relative security. It may even be that people immigrate into the warlord's territory from elsewhere, to benefit from this environment. This would further boost production, and hence the amount the warlord can skim off. Initially the warlord is likely to administer ad hoc, and somewhat rough, justice. But over time, precedents and expectations will be set, and eventually these will be written down. At this point, the territory has a set of laws. Similarly, the amount of payment due from the population is also likely to be documented, and, rather than talking about a protection racket, one might talk about taxation. Although a warlord may initially enforce law and order for his own benefit, everyone else benefits if the result is that they are not assaulted, robbed, raped, or murdered, as they go about their business. This is valued so highly that, in practice, when law and order breaks down, people will actively look for a strong leader, a warlord, who can restore it. So, a key reason why I am prepared to put up with legal constraints on my actions, and pay taxes so that those laws are enforced, is that I do not want to be assaulted, raped, robbed, or murdered, as I go about my daily life. And my experience is that the vast majority of other people feel the same way. In the absence of law and order, life becomes, as Thomas Hobbes put it, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So, I am not an anarchist. I believe that law and order is extremely desirable. Anyone who does not, is either so naive as to be a danger to themselves, or is proposing something that they know will be extremely detrimental to the welfare of most of their fellow human beings. The preceding discussion shows that the fundamental reason we have laws is to protect our persons and property. However, there is an intrinsic paradox here. Law enforcement is only possible because the government will use physical force against lawbreakers if necessary. This is true of all laws and regulations. If you break them, you will be subject to imprisonment, or fines, or other sanctions, and, if you resist the imposition of these, then they will be imposed on you, ultimately by physical force. Further, to fund law enforcement and any other areas of activity, the government will tax the population. Taxes are not optional, and so people are compelled to pay, again with the government ultimately using physical force to impose this. The paradox is therefore that, to protect people from physical violence and robbery, the government will use violence against people, and forcibly take their assets. The law is doing what it is supposed to prevent. Thus, while the benefits of law and order are clear, you can have too much of them. There comes a point where it is not criminals that people need to be protected from, but their own government. And, ultimately, laws aim to prevent me from doing things. Taxation takes my money, which I cannot therefore use for other purposes. Government therefore constrains the options available to me, and the more government there is, the greater these constraints are. As I value choice, I do not want to be subject to laws and taxes that constrain my choices, unless I consider that the benefits I obtain from those laws and taxes clearly outweigh the value of the options I am losing. Suppose that I have no say in the laws and taxes that I am subject to. As everyone is different, and puts different values on different things, my view of whether a law is desirable may well differ from the views of the person or people making that law. I am therefore likely to end up being subject to laws and taxes that I resent. And, as modern governments are addicted to imposing multitudinous laws and regulations on their subjects, and then copiously taxing those subjects to pay for them, in practice, this is likely to cause me considerable discontent. So, if people have no say in the laws that apply to them, they are likely to be discontented. As people are all different, they will probably all be discontented for different reasons, but discontented they will be nonetheless. History shows that if enough people are sufficiently discontented with the laws that apply to them, and have no other way to change those laws, this causes revolutions. History also shows that revolution often results in anarchy. I have already said that I consider anarchy to be extremely undesirable. I therefore prefer a system of government that tries to avoid such an outcome, by giving people a say in the laws that are applied to them. There is such a system that has been tried and tested. It is called democracy. Living in a democracy does not mean that I agree with every law that is enacted, far from it. But it does mean that I have some influence over them, and that makes submitting to the laws I dislike more bearable. It reduces my discontent. So, I am a supporter of democracy. But, democracies come in a variety of forms, and I prefer some of these to others. Firstly, there is the question of who gets to vote. Democracy aims to reduce the risk of people revolting, by giving them a say in the laws that they are subject to. So, the fewer people that are excluded from having such a say, the better. This is an argument for extending the electorate as far as possible. But, on the other hand, if people are going to vote, and have a part in making laws that I will be subject to, then I want to be confident that those voters have the basic education and experience required, both to grasp the issues under debate, and to understand the real-world implications. I will consider the role of the state in education later, but I think that potential voters should be required to pass an exam, to demonstrate a basic level of knowledge, before being admitted to the electorate. Further, if people have no experience of supporting themselves, then they will not be able to understand the real impact legislation can have on people's livelihoods, and I do not believe that they should be allowed to vote. Having a minimum voting age therefore makes sense. It seems to me that the current voting age in the UK of 18 is too low, given that most people of this age will still be in full-time education, and are therefore likely to be somewhat sheltered from the day-to-day realities of providing for themselves. Government is paid for by taxation, and a key purpose of voting is to determine future tax rates. On the basis that those who are paying for something should have control over it, you might argue that anyone not paying tax should not be allowed to vote. The Americans revolted on the grounds that there should be no taxation without representation. This argument effectively turns that on its head and says that there should be no representation without taxation. Now in practice, given the existence of taxes like VAT and duties on various products, pretty much everyone is a taxpayer in some form or another. Therefore, if it is to exclude significant numbers of people from the electorate, I think the argument would have to be that those who are paying less in tax than they receive in state benefits should be denied the vote. However, paying tax is only part of the commitment that law and order demands. What is crucial to avoid anarchy is that people obey the law. Those relying on benefits may be among the poorest members of society, and as such may feel that they have little to lose, and potentially most to gain, should law and order break down. If it is desired that they obey the law, that is a strong argument to include them in the electorate, so that they have a say in the laws that are imposed on them. This brings out a key point, that democracy only works if everyone abides by the decisions that emerge from the democratic process. In a democracy, I am expected to obey the law, even if that law is not to my personal taste. If I do not obey the law, then I am setting my face against democratic principles. Why allow me to vote, if I do not keep my side of the bargain? So, prisoners, and criminals undergoing other legal punishment, should have their right to vote withdrawn. You may say that removing a prisoner's right to vote violates one of their fundamental human rights. I say that, in the absence of law and order, the practical reality is that no one has any human rights, at all. When society breaks down, and the barbarians are burning down your house, and raping your wife, whining about your human rights will get you precisely nowhere. As a plain matter of fact, you only have the rights that society grants to you. Those rights are enforced through the law, and only have effect because people obey the law. If you break the law, you cannot reasonably expect to at the same time benefit from the rights that it provides. As well as who gets to vote, democracies also differ in how those votes are cast. Now, if people are to feel that they have a genuine input into the laws that they live under, they need to be able to cast their votes freely, entirely as they see fit. Thus, votes should be cast in a way that limits the risk of voters being intimidated, or their votes being used fraudulently by others. Assume that you are trying to intimidate me to vote a certain way. If voting is public, for example by a show of hands, then you will know how I have voted. In particular, if I do not cast my vote as you desire, this will be apparent to you, exposing me to your retribution. Thus, I want voting to be secret and private. Further, I want people to have to vote in person. Coercion or fraud is much easier where online or postal voting is being used. You may argue that, despite the increased risk of fraud or coercion, such mechanisms make it easier for people to vote. But, while every voter should have the opportunity to vote, it is reasonable to expect them to make a small effort to do so. Making it too easy to vote increases the risk that people cast their votes casually or flippantly. The way that people vote potentially has a big impact on me, and so my view is that voting is a serious responsibility. Requiring people to make a small effort, for example by taking some time out of their day in order to visit a polling station in person, helps to reinforce this message. Voters also need to have access to information, so that they can make an informed decision as to which way to vote. Having an electorate with the education and experience to understand the issues is necessary, but not sufficient. In order to effectively use that education and experience to discriminate between the available options, voters have to be presented with the full range of views, and the arguments for and against each. Now, there will be opinions that the vast majority of the population consider to be abhorrent. When those opinions are expressed, people may be outraged, or distressed, or both, and their immediate reaction may be that expressing such views should be banned. But, banning such opinions does not eliminate them. As such views are no longer expressed openly, there will be no need to rehearse the arguments against them. But, while they may no longer be raised in public, those opinions will still be expressed in private, where they will not be subject to the same level of challenge as in public debate, and so may gain more widespread acceptance. And, banning a particular opinion sends a message that it is powerful, which can actually make it more attractive to people. So, perversely, banning people from expressing an opinion can help promote it. Conversely, subjecting opinions that are considered repellent to public scrutiny will allow their irrationality and unpleasantness to be exposed to all. After all, if I see an opinion rebutted by multiple arguments and subjected to well-founded ridicule, I am less likely to take it seriously than if I see that society is so scared of it that it is banned. And if an opinion I find repellent can't be reasonably rebutted, well, maybe that is a prompt for me to consider whether my initial reaction to it is justified. So, I may find certain of your views repellent and distressing. But, my view is that you should still be allowed to express them. Without freedom of speech, debate can only be partial, and so democracy is undermined. I have talked about who might be allowed to vote, and how those votes might be cast. But democracies also differ in the matters that the electorate gets to vote on. The most basic form of democracy is that everything the state does has to be approved by a vote of the entire electorate. There are precedents for this. Democracy in ancient Athens was pretty much along these lines. The problem with such an approach is that modern governments make lots of decisions, and holding a referendum to validate each of these individually would leave voters with little time to do anything else. In practice, therefore, the power to enact laws, impose taxes, declare war, and what have you, is typically delegated by voters to an elected government. Although, in theory, that government can still put specific decisions to the electorate, in practice this is rare, and tends to be limited to very material constitutional issues. Recent examples in the UK would include the referendums on Scottish independence from the UK, and on UK independence from the EU. Generally then, voters do not vote on specific decisions. They instead vote to elect a government. There are various voting mechanisms that can be used for this purpose. One approach is to divide the country into regions, or constituencies. The voters in each region then select an individual to represent that region in Parliament, with the candidate who gets the most votes being the one selected. The national parliament is then constituted of the selected representatives of each region, each of whom will typically represent a political party. The party with the most representatives in Parliament will then form the government. This system has several disadvantages. Firstly, although it is usually considered desirable that all constituencies contain the same number of voters, in practice this will not be the case. As each constituency selects one representative to go to Parliament, votes in less populous constituencies will count for more than votes in more populous constituencies. Secondly, it discourages people from voting for candidates who they do not think will win, because such a vote is effectively wasted. The system therefore encourages tactical voting, and makes it difficult for a new party to gain support. If my views are best represented by a candidate from a party with little support, then I want to vote for that candidate, and I want that vote to count. Thirdly, the system can give rise to strange outcomes at national level, with a party having a majority in Parliament, despite having received fewer votes in total, across the entire country, than another party. I think these are significant drawbacks. Democracy works because it gives people a say. If people think their vote is worth less than other votes, or counts for nothing at all, then they will not feel they are getting a say. If enough people feel like this, then democracy will break down. The logic of democracy demands that every vote carries equal weight. For these reasons, I prefer a system of proportional representation. The basic idea of such a system is that each party sends a number of representatives to Parliament, in proportion to the number of votes that party received across the country as a whole. Under this system every vote is equal, less supported parties are represented in Parliament, and the makeup of Parliament better represents the distribution of votes across the entire country. One criticism of proportional representation is that it is more likely to lead to situations where no one party has overall control, and so government is by a coalition of parties. It is said that coalition governments are less able to get things done, because they must build consensus across multiple parties to do so. I do not regard this as a problem. After all, if the makeup of Parliament reflects the distribution of views among voters, and a majority of those in Parliament oppose a particular course of action, there is good reason to consider that such action would also be opposed by a majority of the electorate. The opposite criticism is also made, that coalition governments can lead to governments passing legislation that does not have widespread support. This might happen when a small party, with extreme views, holds the balance of power. As the price for forming a government with a larger party, the small party can demand that some of its policies are passed into law by that government. However, it seems to me that political horse trading of this sort happens under all political systems, both between, and indeed within, political parties. Another criticism is that under a constituency system, each constituency has a representative in Parliament, who voters in that constituency can approach to raise matters of local concern, so that these can be reflected in parliamentary debate. This sort of direct representation is diluted or absent under a system of proportional representation. There is a valid concern here that national government may take actions without receiving input from, and so fully understanding, the impact that these actions will have on a particular community. And this raises wider questions about the constitutional framework within which the government operates, and the role of local government. Constitutions can be structured in various ways. What they all have in common is a system for proposing laws, and a system for deciding on whether or not those laws are implemented. In a genuine democracy, both elements are under the control of the electorate. So, in the UK, broadly speaking, the party with most representatives in Parliament forms a government. The government puts forward proposed laws. Each proposed law is then put to a vote in Parliament, and if it receives majority support it becomes law. Thus, the results of the election determine both the legislative agenda, and whether that proposed legislation ultimately becomes law. By contrast, under the EU system, the elected representatives in the EU Parliament have no power to propose legislation. Rather, the legislative agenda is controlled by the unelected bureaucrats of the European Commission, which puts forward legislation for the EU Parliament to debate. In most cases the EU Parliament only has the power to block legislation, and in some cases, e.g. tax legislation, it does not even have the ability to do that. Because the elected representatives do not have the power to propose new legislation, I would not regard the EU system as genuinely democratic. Furthermore, faced with any problem, bureaucrats will assume that the answer is more regulation, both because it is what they understand, and because it gives them more power. So, it is no surprise that, having placed control of the legislative agenda in the hands of unelected bureaucrats, the EU imposes hundreds and hundreds of new regulations on its citizens each year. In both the UK and EU cases, the legislative process includes an additional stage to those I have just described. In the UK, legislation is subject to scrutiny by the House of Lords, an unelected body that can delay, but not veto, legislation, and, in the EU, legislation has to be approved by the Council. Does this second stage add value? Well, adding an additional layer of scrutiny to the legislative process reduces the risk of passing legislation with unintended consequences. However, establishing a separate body to do this has a cost, which has to be paid for through taxation. So, while scrutinizing legislation for flaws is desirable, it might be better if this scrutiny was performed by people who are already on the payroll, as it were. A scrutinizing body to which each local council sent a representative would meet this criterion and ensure that the impact of proposed legislation on individual communities was considered. Furthermore, a body formed of representatives of elected local councils would clearly be democratic, which certainly cannot be said of the House of Lords. This does however assume that a system of local government exists, and the value of local government is open to question. After all, government legislates to restrict the things I can do, and takes my money in tax to pay for it. I strongly believe that government is necessary, but given the existence of a national government, do I need local government as well? Well, there are two reasons for having local government. The first is administrative. National government makes decisions, which are then implemented by local government. Note that, in this role, local government is delivering outcomes, rather than making decisions, and so does not need to be democratically accountable. However, the second reason for having local government is to make decisions about rules, regulations, taxes, and public services that only apply at a local, rather than at a national, level. If local government is making such decisions, it seems to me that it should be democratically appointed by the voters whose lives will be affected by those decisions, in a similar way to the national government. So, does the benefit of having democratically elected local governments, sitting below the national government, outweigh the cost? Well, one limitation of democracy is that, for example, it is perfectly democratic for 51% of the population to vote that each of them should be paid a large tax-free state income, funded by taxing the other 49%. If this were to happen, the 49% might be somewhat dissatisfied with this state of affairs. There would almost certainly be civil unrest, and quite possibly outright revolution and anarchy. So, to avoid a breakdown of law and order, it is not enough for laws and taxes to be imposed on the basis of democratic principles. They also have to be regarded as fair. Now, what one person regards as fair, another will regard as inequitable. I will have more to say about this when I come to tax. But, it seems to me, that a good starting point is to adopt a principle, that legal rights and obligations should apply to all individual voters equally. If the law forbids me from doing certain things, then all other voters should be so forbidden. If the law requires me to pay tax in certain circumstances, then any other voter in those circumstances should be required to pay the same amount of tax as me. And laws and taxes need to be clear and simple, so that everyone can understand them, and see that they are fair. In passing, note that I am arguing here that all voters should have equal rights and obligations. The argument does not extend to non-voters. I have already pointed out that those who break the law cannot expect to benefit from the rights that it confers. The other group excluded from voting are people who society has decided do not have the understanding or experience to fully grasp the issues under debate and appreciate their real-world implications. Now, you can of course debate about who makes that assessment and how it is made. You can argue that it is not democratic for one group of people to unilaterally exclude another group of people from the democratic process. These are all fair points, and, from time to time, society may wish to consider where the line is drawn, and whether it would be appropriate to move it. However, it does seem to me that a line has to be drawn somewhere. Would you want a 2-year-old to help determine the laws that constrain your behavior? Or somebody's pet dog to get a vote? And, once the assessment of who can vote has been made, and written into law, then democracy requires us to accept it. And, once you accept that these non-voters lack judgment in certain areas, this implies that they may be more readily exploited by others, and, due to their lack of understanding or foresight, may be more likely to act in ways that put themselves or others at risk. It may therefore be that society considers it appropriate to provide them with more legal protection, but also to constrain their ability to act in certain ways. To return to the main argument, the principle of fairness, that all voters should have equal rights and obligations, implies that the rulings of a national government will apply uniformly and nationally. This makes it difficult for national government to address issues that are specific to a particular community, in a manner tailored to that community. We saw some of these issues arise in the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, when the UK government tried to impose a tiered and regionalised system of lockdowns. The criteria used for determining which tier a particular locality was put in were complicated, and widely regarded as arbitrary and subjective. Many communities felt that the level of lockdown imposed on them was unfair, and they were being singled out for punitive treatment. Ultimately, national government abandoned the tiered system and imposed a nationwide, uniform, lockdown. This was by no means universally popular, but it did put an end to accusations of regional bias. But, if local government is making decisions that only impact the voters who elected it, then the principle of fairness, as applied to local government, is limited to those local voters. Thus, local government allows individual communities to democratically address local issues, in the manner that community chooses. In these circumstances, local government gives people more say in how government impinges on them, and I therefore think it is desirable in principle. Whether local government is desirable in practice is a different question. The more constrained local government is in its actions, the less value it has. There will be some such constraints, for example, as democratic principles require that national legislation applies nationally, then, while local governments would be permitted to supplement national legislation, they should not be permitted to disapply it. If complex multi-layered systems of government are put in place, it is difficult for people to know who is responsible for what, and which issues are therefore relevant when voting in a particular election. This reduces democratic accountability. If local government is making decisions that increase costs, but these costs are being funded by central government, then those decisions are being paid for by taxpayers nationwide, who have not had a say in the decision. This is not fair. So, I support a simple single-layer system of local government, with wide powers to introduce supplementary legislation, including tax-raising powers, so that local communities can self-fund local initiatives. I will mention a couple of examples of how this might work in practice, in the following wider discussion of what governments do, and how, in my opinion, they can best do it. The things government does can be conveniently considered under 4 headings. Governments set out laws and regulations, which tell people what they can and cannot do. They enforce those rules. They provide people with services. And they tax people, to pay for it all. Any laws and regulations government enacts will forbid certain actions, and therefore potentially constrain the choices available to me. Enforcing these rules will have a cost. Any services that government provides will also have a cost. All these costs will ultimately fall on the taxpayer. And if I do not obey the laws or pay the taxes it imposes on me, the government will use physical force against me. Given this analysis, I do not want government to do anything that is not necessary. Government is desirable, because it can protect me. But unnecessary government costs me money, constrains the choices available to me, and threatens me with violence. If government is acting in ways that do not protect me, I regard that as unnecessary. If government is imposing laws and taxes on me, to protect me in ways that I can already do for myself on a voluntary basis, then that is unnecessary. If the cost of government action is disproportionate to the benefits I gain from that action, then that is unnecessary. Laws can be drafted in 2 ways. They can tell me what I am allowed to do, or they can tell me what I am not allowed to do. Laws that tell me what I am allowed to do are more restrictive. They prevent me from doing anything, other than what the laws specifically permit. Laws that tell me what I am not allowed to do are far less restrictive. They allow me to do anything that is not expressly prohibited. As I greatly value choice, I much prefer laws that ban specific actions to laws that only permit specific actions. I am therefore suspicious of constitutional schemes that seek to enshrine my basic freedoms in law. That often means writing laws that set out all the things I am allowed to do, with the implication that acting in any manner not on the list is forbidden and can be punished. The primary purpose of government is to impart law and order, so that people have the confidence to go about their daily lives. Law and order protects me. I consider it to be desirable, and very much want it to be maintained. Now, if law and order are to be maintained, then it is important that people have respect for, and obey, all the laws in force. If people start to pick and choose which laws they are going to follow, that will engender a mindset in which obeying the law is seen as optional, and lead to more and more laws being ignored. Law and order breaks down. People are more likely to obey laws that they support, and are more likely to break laws that they consider unreasonable. For example, most people support the law against murder, and it is widely obeyed. Conversely, many people continue to take illegal drugs, because they consider that to be a matter of personal choice, and many people will drive at more than 70 miles per hour on the motorway, because they consider that speed limit to be too low. If a government enacts legislation that does not have widespread support, that legislation is likely to be broken by significant numbers of people. Passing laws which you know are likely to be widely ignored is counterproductive. It undermines the very law and order that government exists to provide. The costs of enforcing such a law, and so the associated tax burden, are likely to be disproportionately high, and even if successful, so that the law is widely obeyed, its imposition can lead to significant resentment, and perceptions of unfairness, which can in turn erupt in civil unrest. This is an argument for constitutions that do not allow legislation to be enacted on a simple majority vote, but set the bar higher, requiring say a 2/3 majority. Indeed, my view is that an even higher bar could reasonably be set. Setting a high bar for enacting new legislation is also desirable, as it means that fewer laws get put into force. Having only a few laws is desirable, as it means that people can know what laws are in place, and so obey them, without having to consult a lawyer. The principle of only having a few laws is not one that modern governments follow. For example, currently the EU adopts hundreds of regulations, directives, and decisions, each and every year. This overload of legislation is not unique to the EU. Modern governments all seem to feel that, to justify their existence, they must continually pump out large volumes of legislation and regulation. In practical terms, no one who is not a specialist is going to be able to keep track of what all this legislation requires, and whether or not it applies to them. So, I am put in a position where I am expected to obey laws that I don't even know about, with the potential for suffering legal punishment if I do not obey. You may say that most of this legislation doesn't apply to me as an individual, and therefore it is safe for me to ignore it. Well, this may be the case, most of the time, and many people do seem to use that approach. But, I consider that I have a commitment to obey the law, and I consider that keeping my commitments is of critical importance. Not knowing what the law is, and therefore not knowing what I am committed to, is not a situation I want to be in. Turning from individuals to organizations, any organization that wishes to function within the law will need to keep up with legal developments. Large volumes of constantly changing legislation makes doing this difficult and expensive, requiring either significant internal resource, or external legal advice, or both. It is undesirable that organizations are put in a position where they are effectively forced to take legal advice, just to understand whether any relevant legislation exists, never mind what it means. This places a particularly disproportionate burden on smaller organizations. And, in practice, whether you are an individual or an organization, you are likely to have unwittingly broken some obscure requirement that is recorded somewhere in this mass of legislation. Which means that if the government, or an organization, or your next-door neighbor, wants to pin something on you, if they look hard enough, they will be able to do so. Rather than protecting you, the law has become a danger to you. Now, some of this never-ending torrent of legislation may be necessary. However, many people's perception is that most current legislation and regulation is over-engineered, unnecessary, red tape. The outcome is likely to be frustration and contempt for the law, which people are therefore less likely to follow, even when they know what it is. Another desirable feature of laws is that they should be simple, so people can understand them. After all, if I don't understand what the law requires, I am only likely to obey it by luck, rather than by judgment. much modern legislation is anything but simple. For example, consider tax legislation. This is ferociously complicated, to the point where you have to be a full-time specialist to understand it. Indeed, there are specialists in each different type of tax. In this environment, top tax consultants charge over £1,000 an hour, but it still makes financial sense for companies to pay this, as without specialist advice they will be unable to optimize their tax position, which will cost them more than the consultancy fees. This is undesirable on several levels. Firstly, because subjecting people to legislation that they cannot understand without requiring specialist training or paying for external advice is unfair and unreasonable. Secondly, because the complexity is unnecessary, there is no reason why tax legislation cannot be simple. Thirdly, while the tax consultants are making a fortune, and their clients are saving money, one might feel that the whole artificial exercise is something of a waste of the consultant's undoubted brainpower, which surely could be put to better use. Turning back to general legislation, if an objective is simplicity, then this can be achieved by passing laws which set out the key principles to be followed, rather than detailed volumes of regulations trying, and probably failing, to cover each possible situation. Such a principle-based approach means that people understand what the law is trying to achieve. In most cases, it will then be clear what the law requires. Now, in practice, there may be some cases where applying the principles set out in such legislation is not straightforward, but requires some judgment. Assume that I am accused of breaking the law in such a case. If the law is simple, and the objectives and principles of the legislation are clear, then in order to establish my guilt or innocence, the facts can be established, I can explain why I did what I did, and a jury can use its judgment to decide what happened, and if I acted reasonably, based on the purpose of the legislation. This is likely to result in a verdict based on the purpose of the legislation, and common sense. Compare that with a situation where the law is technical and detailed, with pages and pages of regulations. The form of the legislation means that my case will have to be based upon detailed legal arguments, about drafting and precedents, looking to open or close, probably unintended, loopholes. The jury is not being asked if I acted in accordance with the purpose of the legislation, but is being asked to assess these detailed legal arguments. Because the case hangs on these technical legal questions, the judge's summing up of those arguments is likely to have great influence on the verdict that is reached. The jury has been marginalized, and my fate depends, not on the purpose of the legislation, but on its detailed drafting, and how this is understood by the judge. One reason that legal drafting might be detailed and tortuous is to try to eliminate ambiguity. After all, if I read the law one way, and my local policeman reads it another, then I may have my collar felt when I think I am acting perfectly legally. And the policeman may be perfectly happy with what you are doing, even though based on my reading of the law, you are breaking it. Neither of these outcomes is desirable. There are two reasons why laws might be ambiguous. One is that they are overly complex. The other is that they fundamentally rely on subjective concepts. Overly complex laws can be replaced with simpler ones. But I have said that subjectivity is inevitable, existence is fundamentally subjective. So, it seems that there is a real problem here. How can we have objective laws, if we all have our own subjective understanding of what those laws are? Well, democracy is a communal effort, which requires people to communicate with each other. People can only communicate if they have some common experience. In practice, it seems that people do generally agree about their immediate perceptions. As a result, we adopt the assumption that we all inhabit the same external physical world. Without that assumption, we are each trapped in our own wholly subjective individual world, and it is difficult to see how democracy, society, or indeed any group endeavor, could function at all. We make that assumption because we have to make it, and, having made it, we have to rely on it. It is vitally important. However, once we get away from our immediate perceptions, we routinely disagree. Thus, while I may be certain of my own beliefs, emotional reactions, and so forth, I cannot assume that other people believe the same things or feel the same way. The implication is that to minimize their subjective element, laws need to be grounded in the world of shared immediate perception, that is to say, in the external physical world. If I am accused of a crime, my guilt or innocence will then be based on my actions in that world. As those actions take place in the single shared physical world that we all agree that we inhabit, they are objects of immediate perceptions that will be common to all, and can therefore, at least in theory, be objectively established. On the other hand, if my guilt or innocence depends on what another person thinks or feels, then I am at that person's mercy. There is no way of directly accessing someone else's consciousness, and so of being certain what another person thinks or feels. So, I can be found guilty on someone's word, with no way of verifying what is said. Further, two people can, and often do, react to the same circumstances in very different ways. So, my acting in a particular way may or may not be criminal, depending on who is present and how they are feeling. Such laws do not protect me, they expose me to risk. I said that if people are to obey the law, they have to know what it is. If the law keeps changing, then it is difficult for people to keep up with what is expected of them. Further, if significant changes in legislation are routine, people may come to see the law as arbitrary and capricious, which may undermine the respect that they have for the law, and, again, make them less likely to obey it. Stable legislation also enables people to plan for the future, with confidence that what they are working towards today won't be taken away from them by change in the law tomorrow. Thus, stable legal and government structures, and predictable tax rates, are beneficial. A process of evolution is preferable to one of revolution. On this basis, institutions and traditions will be respected, and allowed to develop and change organically, over time. A key implication of this is that where current structures do not align with my preferences, I do not support tearing them down overnight and rebuilding them from scratch. I regard my preferences as a target, to be used as a point of aim, as institutions and laws gradually evolve. If laws are few, simple, and stable, then it is reasonable to expect people to know what they are. An understanding of the legal obligations that apply to voters could be taught both to pupils at school and to immigrants. I envisage a situation where the legislation can be set out in a single volume. Demonstrating that you have read and understood the contents of this volume could then be part of the test I have suggested could be required for someone to become a voter. If laws are to be kept, they must be enforced. If people know that laws are being broken with impunity, they are less likely to obey the law themselves, less willing to pay taxes to a government that is not enforcing law and order, and so law and order starts to break down. So, laws need to be enforceable. What makes a law enforceable? Well, firstly, a law cannot be enforced if no one knows that it has been broken. Passing a law, banning people from doing things that no one will ever find out about, is therefore counterproductive, as that law will be broken with impunity. For example, the government might pass a law against abortion, but, in practice, a desperate woman who is at a relatively early stage of pregnancy can still discreetly visit a backstreet abortionist. No one else knows that the woman was pregnant, and neither the woman, nor the abortionist, is likely to bring the fact that a fetus has been aborted to the attention of the authorities. So, enforcing such a law is very challenging. Even if lawbreaking is readily visible, government has to make sure that resources are in place to enable people who have broken the law to be identified, and that these resources are used. For example, if littering is illegal, and there is litter on the street, it is clear that an offense has occurred. But, unless there are police, or others, on the street, who can see people dropping litter, feel that they are empowered to enforce the law, and who will be active in doing so, or there are other ways of identifying litter droppers, such as CCTV cameras, then people will continue to drop litter without being prosecuted, and the law will be regularly ignored. Enforcing the law has other beneficial effects. If people see that those who break the law are punished, this will have a deterrent effect, reducing the frequency with which the law is broken, and so reducing the cost of enforcement and the corresponding tax burden.